So I would love to give just a quick overview of how our time together is going to unfold. The event's going to start with a pithy summary of this great new report, and that's going to be delivered by Jamie Kneen. And after that, we're going to open up and hear from each of our speakers. We're going to kind of pull out on this theme of resistance that I think will come out quite a bit in the report. The question of these sacrifice zones that this kind of extractive economy requires to be produced. Many people have always been and are continuing to stand up and resist those forms of extraction in their communities. And we're going to hear from people who are working in those communities and supporting those communities about that work, and kind of a report back of what's happening on the ground in the areas that they're working in. Then we're going to open up to audience question and answer. And so we want to welcome you to use the Q&A function at the bottom to ask questions anytime. And when we get to the Q&A section, we're going to try and pull out as many of those as we can to get the panelists to respond to them as well. After that, we're going to move into a kind of more open conversation amongst the panelists about the big thorny questions that are coming out of this report and these issues generally around the green transition and the actual mineral and extractive implications of making a rapid energy transition. And then I am putting our participants on the spot at the very end of this event to actually dream big with us at the very end about what the world could look like if we actually won the fights that each of us are engaged in to win this better world. So we're going to try and just think about, what does success actually look like in the work that we're doing around this. Such a pleasure to have you all here. And I'm now going to throw it over to Jamie Kneen. So one thing I'm going to tell you is, in addition to introducing each of our speakers and their great expertise, I'm also going to tell you a little something personal or surprising about them, because as well as being experts, all of us are comrades here. And so it's good to get to know people on a human level as well. So I want to let you know that Jamie is the Communications and Outreach Coordinator for MiningWatch. He is a lead author of the new report, Turning Down the Heat: Can We Mine Our Way Out of the Climate Crisis? But two other things that you might not know about Jamie are, first, that he used to shear sheep, though it may not be responsible to either the sheep or to him to try to do that now. And second, that he started playing jigs and reels on the mandolin because every jam session has way too many guitars. Over to you, Jamie, to walk us through the conference report, and congratulations on its publication.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Monique, for that opening. And thank you all for participating. So 1 year ago, MiningWatch Canada brought together almost 200 people from 6 continents, community and grassroots representatives, experts and academics, researchers and activists, to explore important issues around the need for metals and minerals for renewable energy. This is a summary of the conference report we've just released, which you will find on our website, as Katie mentioned, and I've put a link in the chat box. Participants heard from communities at the front lines of raw material extraction for green energy. We took in some of the most important new research and thinking on these issues and looked at ideas and applications to address both demand for materials and the practical conditions for their extraction and use. By putting the experience of frontline communities, those facing the social and environmental impacts of mining, at the center of the discussion, the conference placed the urgent need for rapid decarbonization in the context of the ecological and social limits of extraction, whether of fossil fuels or of metals and minerals. The conference was organized around 4 themes. What are the impacts on the ground from the increased demand for minerals? What are the trends and predictions of minerals demand for renewable energy? How can the demand for mining be reduced or even eliminated? And what conditions need to be placed on the sourcing of minerals for renewable energy? So first, what are the impacts? Well, there is still little awareness among the general public and decision makers, and even in the environmental movement, that in addition to massive consumption and contamination of water, the mining sector generates phenomenal quantities of solid waste, much of it toxic, that must be stored, monitored, and in many cases cared for in perpetuity. a public liability for current and future generations. And you can see this in a wee infographic on page 6 of the report. The nascent renewable energy fueled mining boom is already having dramatic social and environmental impacts, including on Indigenous and human rights. The mining industry and other actors are attempting to frame this new mining from the heights of the Andes to the bottom of the sea as necessary for the energy transition. Protecting communities, Indigenous and human rights, and sensitive places requires the challenge to be reframed as one of a just transition, putting environmental justice and social justice ahead of profit and endless economic growth. The theme of sacrifice zones emerged strongly in the conference, with communities from Canada to Latin America to the South Pacific declaring that they are not willing to be the ones to be sacrificed for the sake of preserving corporate profits and others' overconsumption. A call for fair conditions for mining came from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where poverty combines with market demand to drive people into small-scale mining under harsh conditions, while the promise of large-scale mining to lift the country out of poverty has been a cruel betrayal. Breaking from the pattern of colonial and capitalist exploitation has to be part of a just transition. Second, what are the trends and predictions? Projections of increased demand for metals and minerals for electrification and increased renewable energy capacity vary, depending on growth scenarios and technology mixes, but they range from simple multiples to orders of magnitude larger. And you can see this illustrated on page 9 and 10 of the report. Any growth in energy demand means a concomitant increase in metal and mineral demand. Electric vehicles emerge as the main demand drivers for many of the energy transition minerals. Current projections are based on assumptions of continued growth in demand, both in wealthy industrialized countries and in poorer countries. They also don't take into consideration the limiting factors that may significantly affect access to raw materials or technological shifts. These scenarios can change dramatically if different assumptions are made in terms of production, consumption, and transportation and travel. The third theme, how can demand for mining be reduced or even eliminated? The conference identified 3 low-carbon or low-material policy directions that would help reduce primary mineral demand and its associated impacts. First, to encourage, support, or require greater mineral efficiency through reuse, recycling, circular economies, urban mining, and extended producer responsibility. Second, curtail unnecessary mining for speculation or for luxury or harmful products. Third, systemic changes to reduce demand for energy and resources as part of strategies for degrowth and truly sustainable local and global economies. Low energy, low material urban development design and transportation systems are an especially important focus in North America. A just transition requires equitable distribution of both energy and material wealth. Workers cannot be asked to make sacrifices that consumers and investors are not also asked to make. Such a transition provides opportunities for redesign at all levels, from building codes to municipal and regional planning to global flows of goods and materials, a reorganization of work and production, trade and consumption. It is also crucial to avoid short-term measures and investments that may block or impede deeper changes, and to avoid relying on new technologies that may not materialize, or strategies that may leave deep imbalances in place, such as decoupling, offsets, and emissions trading. And our fourth theme, what conditions need to be placed on the sourcing of materials for renewable energy? The conference outlined 4 critical areas of policy actions to ensure cleaner, more responsible, and less harmful sourcing of materials. First, require the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples and the consent of local communities prior to mining exploration or development. End the antiquated colonial practice of free entry, still prevalent in many places, including Canada. Establish no-go zones to protect ecologically, socially, and culturally sensitive areas, protecting watersheds, sacred places, glaciers, agricultural land, and ecologically based livelihoods and economies, and banning deep-sea mining. Second, prioritize environmental protection and prevent perpetual and intergenerational impacts, especially from toxic mine waste disasters and contamination. Third, enforce the polluter pay principle with mandatory financial assurances and ensure that operators have the necessary financial resources to remediate spills and environmental impacts and to rehabilitate closed mines. And fourth, protect and prevent human rights abuse in supply chains with legal requirements and complementary voluntary measures for responsible investment in purchasing, mandatory human rights due diligence and transparency requirements, including gender impact assessment, and making public financial institutions, governments, private and union pension funds, and so on, all apply human rights criteria to any investments in mining. So, by way of conclusion, mining has an ecological and socio-economic footprint far larger than the mine sites themselves, affecting whole regions and watersheds and posing a long-term threat through toxic contamination and massive mine waste dumps. As the industry expands and moves into new and more remote regions, affected communities and Indigenous peoples are increasingly declaring that they are unwilling to have their territories turned into sacrifice zones. In the context of biodiversity loss and overshoot of natural systems carrying capacity, energy consumption is but one factor, albeit a hugely important one, that needs to be addressed in order to not just avoid ecological and economic collapse, but to achieve sustainable and equitable prosperity for all. We would like to thank all the participants in the conference and the speakers and the funders, who are the ECHO Foundation, the 11th Hour Project, Oxfam Canada, the Center for Research on Latin America and the Caribbean at York University, and the Interdisciplinary Research Group on the Territories of Extraction at Ottawa University. The conference was a year ago, and although much has changed with the COVID-19 pandemic and the responses to it, none of this has become any less important. In fact, with the disruption caused by the pandemic, the need to design and build social and economic recovery plans, and the opportunity or necessity to integrate a response to the climate crisis with that recovery, it has become even more critical. This is a pivotal moment. We have seen how service and care workers, mostly women and often racialized, are as essential as they are underpaid. We have seen corporate profiteering and governments using the pandemic to ramp up repression and intensify extractivism. Corporate culture leads governments to build their green recovery plans on green capitalism and continued extractivism, simply shifting the targets of extraction from fossil fuels to metals, and like Quebec most recently, not even bothering to aim at their Paris targets. But the pandemic has also created opportunities to challenge assumptions about what is necessary and what is possible. We know who the essential workers are, and that the essential resiliency of our society is not based on material or energy overconsumption. We know what needs to be done, and we're working together to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie, for that great summary of a really fabulous report. And I'd really just encourage everyone, you can see in the chat, there's direct links to the report in French and in English. There's some fantastic graphs and summaries in there, and it's a wonderful document. And Jamie, thank you so much for walking us through it. So just a quick reminder again to our audience, I see we have almost 190 people who have joined us here. I did a quick scan through the chat that we have people from at least 4 different continents and almost a dozen different countries. It's really great to have all of you here. If you haven't already introduced yourself in the chat, please feel free to. And we're going to start off by giving some time to each of our panelists to respond and just give us a bit of grounding of like what the situation is from their perspective on the ground and the work that they are doing currently. One of my old comrades, John Jordan, a really well-established activist in the UK, would always talk about this idea of the activist DNA, that there's twin strands of activist DNA, and those twin strands are resistance and alternatives. And I think you heard Jamie kind of pulling out those 2 pieces in the report. There's what we have to say no to, and then there's the alternatives that we need to build. And so I want to just start off this part of the conversation by grounding us in the resistance. How are people standing up and fighting back, and what has changed over the past year or so? We're also going to be pulling out this theme around sacrifice zones. I think all of us are familiar now with the idea that extraction, whether it's for fossil fuels, for rare earth minerals, having an extractive economy inherently requires sacrifice zones. That means people and places that are considered sacrificial so that these items can be extracted, usually for the happiness and well-being of the wealthiest people in the world. I think one of the things that we've been seeing in the past few years is these sacrifice zones seem to be growing. And so we're going to be hearing from them all over the world and from the people who have been leading the resistance to this manner of thinking and the idea that some people or some places must be treated as disposable. This is an idea that we want to just keep resisting and breaking down in our work and in our cultural understanding of how we all are related to each other. So I am very honored to be able to introduce to you Ramon Balcazar, who is joining us from San Pedro de Atacama, Chile. Ramon is the founder of a local NGO that's called Tanti, which means seed, and a member of the Observatorio Plurinacional de Salares Andinos, the plurinational observatory of the Andean salt flats, which is also known as OPSAL. So Ramon is a PhD student in rural development at the Autonomous Metropolitan University of Mexico. Something you may not know about him is that he was born in Santiago to a rural family. He has lived in 6 continents, backpacked across 26 others in 4 continents, and that he loves street food, photography, and techno music. So Ramon has been working in and is reporting to us from the Lithium Triangle, which stretches across Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. And this is an area where salt water containing lithium is being pumped out of the earth and dried out to extract the lithium within it to meet the growing demand for lithium batteries around the world. So this is the kind of extraction that combines with copper mining to endanger the water table in the communities where it's happening, and it's meeting growing resistance from local communities and civil society across the country and region. Ramon, you spoke to us about the idea of multiple crises, that, you know, there is an ecological crisis, there is an extractive crisis, there's also a democratic crisis that you're living through. Give us a sense of how these multiple crises are playing out and what the resistance on the ground looks like. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you again for the invitation. Merci pour l'invitation, c'est un plaisir. In this very moment here in Chile, we are actually under a state of exemption because of the social crisis that, you know, exploded last year. A couple of weeks ago, we voted in a referendum in order actually to take the Pinochet's constitution out of our political system. So we've been living with this since 1973, which is a lot of time. And the social environmental crisis is directly related to neoliberalism imposed by this dictatorship. I have to say that the sacrifice zones in Chile actually had the highest rates of approval for the new constitution in the country, and the lowest rates within the 3 richest departments in Santiago. So that's not a coincidence. This moment, in San Pedro de Atacama, which is it's a small village. It's a couple of kilometers away from San Pedro de Atacama, origin of around 20% of the world's lithium today. And it's very ironical because here in this village, access to water is very limited, also to electricity. Actually, electricity depends also on fuel, fossil fuels. I think that that's just an overview, and we need to kind of understand where minerals come from. And this reality is mostly hidden by the media, or of course by our government and corporations that actually say that they are environmentally responsible, they are helping communities and the country, and so on. So just a quick overview. Here in Atacama Salt Flats, maybe some of you know that there are 18 indigenous communities organized under the Council of Atacameño Peoples. And they've been dealing with SQM and Albemarle, and it's a very complex situation. SQM especially having a case, still an open case due to environmental damage in the salt flat. So I'd say that the situation here is there is a lot of division among communities, indigenous, non-indigenous, because of this situation, because the authorities also trying to support the companies and ensure the extraction, because this is apparently their role today. You know, the state is captured by corporations. So today communities are kind of abandoned by the state. So I'd say that the situation is very hard here. The environmental damage is kind of done because the operations have been here for decades. But what worries us actually as OPSAL the most is that the conflicts are actually expanding to other salt flats in other regions, affecting other communities, which are not really prepared for the situation in very isolated areas and regions. And today we have a Maricunga salt flat in Atacama region affecting Koya communities and affecting Ramsar sites, national parks. But during COVID, during the pandemic, actually the environmental authorities have been given the environmental permits to these operations. These are also multinationals and some state-owned companies operating there. And actually today, just an hour ago, you can see maybe on Twitter, Opsal, we shared some pictures of some machines like working in the salt flat without any permit. So that's the level of the situation. But in Coipasa salt flat, a bit further in the north, in Tarapacá region, some Aymara communities are actually facing the intervention of a Canadian company called Lithium Chile. They are trying to explore in their wetlands, the wetlands where they feed the cattle, mostly alpacas. But if you go to the company's website, they published last year that they had the social license for for the exploration. So there's a lot of there are a lot of contradictions between the official statements of these companies, what the communities are saying. But the situation is that the communities are abandoned by the state anyway. So now we're very worried about that. We know that these communities need our support. We need more knowledge about the salt flats, about the watersheds. Most of decisions have been made over a lack of information constantly, and the new projects and all this pressure from the international demand for the transition and the electric vehicle market is actually what worries us a lot. We don't see actually our local authorities kind of understanding how big the impacts can be. So for that reason, I think that these kind of networks and the work that most of you are doing is so important, and also being here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ramon. For those of us like me who live on the land now called Canada, hearing about Canadian companies being called out for this work is becoming, it's a more and more familiar routine. And I think it really speaks to the responsibility that those of us who benefit from those companies, many of them are headquartered in Toronto, right, not too far away from here, that it's a part of our work to hold them accountable. So hearing a lot of these themes around the contradictions that the needs of economic development sometimes push communities into these really difficult binds, this growing kind of lawlessness of companies kind of going off on their own, governments not enforcing their own laws. And the question of what is social license and how does this actually play out? I want to thank you, Jamie, for pointing out that if anyone is tweeting about the conference, it would be great if you could use the hashtag turning down the heat. Really appreciate that. Thank you. And for those of you who are just joining, we have simultaneous interpretation available in French. Just click on the interpretation globe at the bottom and you'll be able to hear the audio in French. So thank you so much. I am next going to throw to Andrew Whitmore, known as Whit, the Finance Advocacy Officer of the Deep Sea Mining Campaign. Whit was a founding member of the MiningWatch collective in the late 1980s. He's a former coordinator at Indigenous Peoples Links, PIP Links, and is currently the co-chair of the London Mining Network. Whit is the author of a forthcoming War on Want report on minerals for the energy transition, including the move to a circular society. So Whit, maybe you'll tease that concept out for us a little bit in your remarks. So something you might not know about Whit is that he's both an obsessive collector of Jamaican ska music and an obsessive cultivator of chilies. And he's joining us today from London. So Whit's going to speak to us a little bit about deep sea mining. And as I was prepping for this conference, I was talking to Jamie and saying, so what is this? And here's what I'll give you my best understanding, that if anyone who has seen the Planet Earth documentaries, who's seen these incredible columns rising up from the ocean floor that take thousands of years to form and are incredibly mineral rich and spew these boiling hot water out through them, the deep sea mining process is essentially coming in and just cutting these things down and grinding them up for the rare minerals that are held within them. So this is the kind of thing that's kind of sounds like it's done incredibly through an out of sight, out of mind approach to it. And Whit is on the front lines of pushing the growing resistance to this practice. So Whit, can you give us an update on where that's at and the state of the movement that's pushing for a global moratorium on the practice of deep sea mining?
Sure. Thanks very much, Katie. Thanks for the opportunity to speak, and thanks for that intro. I think I look forward to presenting on ska music and chilies at a later date. But I think your intro to deep sea mining was very good, but I probably add a couple of quick things, if I may. One is there are different types of deep sea mining. So you mentioned the sea vents, but then there's also mining on cobalt-rich mounts. And then probably the most explored at the moment is the so-called polymetallic nodules that rest on deep sea abyssal plains. Such mining can also take place in either country's territorial waters, or importantly, in discussions that may come up in international waters, or the so-called excellently named high seas that always make me think of pirates. So the rules on extraction in international waters have been set by an intergovernmental body called the International Seabed Authority. And then final point, it's also worth stressing that there's been no commercial mining to date. So I'll start with updates from Papua New Guinea. And that's because Jonathan Meselam of the Alliance of Sawara Warriors spoke at last year's conference. So I got in touch with him to get an update. And he passed on his thanks and confirmed, perhaps unsurprisingly, that the Alliance and the community's stance continues to be that they're seeking a ban on deep sea mining. The main company they were fighting, which is the Vancouver-based Nautilus Minerals, declared itself bankrupt in the Supreme Court of British Columbia last year. However, Jonathan pointed out that the two main investors, who are now trading as a company called Deep Sea Mining Finance, have now privately owned the assets of Nautilus, including the mining licenses. Therefore, Jonathan and communities were surprised when a local hearing was scheduled in July this year to consult on renewing the licenses. As a result, the Alliance of Sawara Warriors organised the communities petitioning against it and questioning how they could be asked to renew licenses when the parent company was bankrupt. And the communities were basically pointed out to the Papua New Guinean government, we know you're the same people, come clean. I think the other bit of news from Papua New Guinea is that Jonathan's one of the plaintiffs in a national court case where they're seeking documents on the initial approval of the licenses from the government's Mineral Resources Authority. And they won a recent victory in the court where a judge has agreed that there is a case to answer, and they're now approaching the authority to gain access to those papers. And if that's refused, then they'll go back to court. I think that's also been an important case because there's no freedom of information law in Papua New Guinea, so it's setting precedents for citizens to get that sort of information. Elsewhere in the wider Pacific, there really is a growing resistance, and from the Pacific, and primarily because it's the focus of exploration and potential exploitation, both in national and international waters. As part of the fallout from the bankruptcy of Nautilus, another Canadian-based deep sea miner, Deep Green, has bought the licenses in the Kingdom of Tonga. So civil society started to organise there and held a recent island-wide meeting. And the message from participants at that meeting was clear as they unanimously voiced opposition to deep sea mining in their own waters and in international waters, calling for a ban. And I think they also have concerns given that the Tongan government is in theory financially responsible for the company's actions in international waters. I think it's notable that when Nautilus went bankrupt, it basically left the Papua New Guinea government with an estimated $24 million as a result. I'd also add that Deep Green is a growing concern to many of us internationally because it's taking something of a leadership role in promoting deep sea mining, particularly promoting that idea that erroneously we would say it's essential for the energy transition. Elsewhere in the Pacific, there seems to be growing civil society campaigning. Citizens in the Cook Islands, which is heavily promoting deep sea mining in its own waters, have started a campaign for a moratorium. There's also a growing regional movement calling for a ban, or drawing on the idea of a blue line in defence of the final frontier. I think that is important in the sense that it is an industry that hasn't started. So civil society, we're coming together to battle to act in resistance to stop an entire industry before it can do any damage. And those calls have also been echoed, for instance, by the Prime Minister of Fiji for a moratorium on deep sea mining, and that was supported by Prime Ministers in Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea. I'll just finish by mentioning what's happening at the international level, where the International Seabed Authority is trying to finalise rules for exploitation. They were due to be meant to be finished by the end of 2020, but thanks to COVID, the next session is probably unlikely to happen until February of next year. And while there's a delay, moratorium calls are globally growing, and so far they've involved scientists, parliaments, including the European Parliament, fishing industries, and numerous NGOs. And more organisations seem to be coming on board. There was recently an excellent viral message that went out from the Oxygen Project, and I'll try and put that into the chat box later for people to see. And we're also expecting a joint NGO statement on transition minerals in early 2021. One of the calls of that will be avoiding minerals from deep sea mining, and the focus of that will be on particularly on companies working on batteries or on energy transition technology. And I also know from my own work at the Deep Sea Mining Campaign, we've got a growing number of private banks who are basically pivoting investment on deep sea mining. Then finally, it's worth mentioning that civil society groups in many Western countries are increasingly coming together to coordinate as well. We've just started doing this in the UK, and we're following on from groups in Belgium, Germany, and France. I think that's the update on the deep sea mining. I mean, I think I'm probably near time, so I would like to make comments, as you mentioned, on that idea of circular society, but maybe we can save that for the discussion later. But a tease and a trailer to the idea that we can come back to that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Whit. It's so interesting hearing about the kind of stickiness of chasing after these companies that are able to run themselves into the ground and then start up anew. But also the hope of the possibility of actually getting a functional moratorium on an industry that hasn't totally taken off yet. I am delighted next to turn to Trusha Reddy, who's joining us from Johannesburg, South Africa. Trusha is the program head for Woman Building Power, Energy, and Climate Justice at the Woman African Alliance. She's a global and Global South experienced advocate for climate justice with more than 15 years working both within and alongside civil society organizations. Trusha has a passionate commitment to driving much needed progressive change, and you may not know that she likes to torture herself regularly with hot yoga sessions. Trisha, your work takes place in the intersections of climate change, feminism, and the front lines of fossil fuel extraction. Can you talk to us a bit about what the right to say no means in the context of this global extraction boom that's going on and in the communities that you're working in? And how do you see the intersections of human rights, resource extraction, and all of these other effects playing out in your work right now? Tell us about how climate justice movements in Africa are building power and building resistance at the same time. Over to you.
So yeah, hi again, everyone. Congratulations on the report. And it's wonderful to see so many people coming onto this call and being part of this really important and interesting discussion. And I'm really happy to be part of this as well. So I want to speak about the reality of our African context. So the context in which I'm based, where we still have a majority of people across the region being rural based, and the majority of those people are actually women peasant farmers. And obviously because of women's gender prescribed roles of having to care for their communities or for their families, to provide food and water, they end up being, as peasant farmers, living closest to what we call nature. And so they know very intimately sort of how to live in harmony with nature as well, whether it's the seasons and cycles and how best to ensure that it is a symbiotic relationship and not an extractive one. And so when there is a disruption to the system, I would call it, this disruption to their lives and livelihoods in these contexts, through these extractive practices, through the relentless pursuit of new coal, new oil, new rare earth minerals, as we're talking about now, which is the latest sort of pursuit. And on top of that, meeting with the nexus of climate impacts as well, and both, of course, impacting on each other, we see that women are impacted most profoundly. The women in these contexts, and of course within their communities, are impacted most profoundly. This is what we see. And of course, the destruction of their environment, the displacement of people is also, it's this violence is both on people and both on the environment as well, and particularly on women's bodies, because extractive industries tend to be extremely violent in the way they pursue profit at any extent, and it usually is meted out on women's bodies, particularly through sexual assault and so on, to be able to ensure that the sacrifice zones, that they have a laid claim onto them. So when we talk about the right to say no, when women are actually stepping up and saying no, what we are seeing is that they are saying no, not just in defense of their own lives and their livelihoods, but it's also in defense of nature. It's in defense of the forest. It's in defense of the land. It's in defense of the air and the water, because of their sort of closeness and their intimacy and relation to the land, to the water, to the forest. So it's really, the right to say no is really about that. It is about something bigger. It is about defense and protection of our planet, essentially. And so, I mean, I have just spoken about, the fact that the intensification of the extractive industry to sort of get the very last drop of oil, for example, particularly in our continent, as we have seen aggressively in the Niger Delta and so on, is extremely violent. And the more that women say no, the more that they resist, the more the violence against them. The most recent experience we've just had now, really tragically, has been in South Africa, where there's been an assassination of an elderly woman who's actually stepped up and been very clear about saying no to the expansion of a coal mine. And really she was, in the way in which the industry functions. Of course, you can't really link the guilt directly to them, but because of the ways in which they operate, which is through manipulation of the communities and division of the communities, the result has been that somebody like her, who's been stepping up and knows that the value of the land and the water and the air and so on is much more than what is going to be provided by this coal mine, which is only going to mete out destruction, of course, of people, their livelihoods and nature. That she stepped up and said that, and the result of this saying no is in the assassination. And we see this over and over again in all of our territories across the region, meted out on communities, but specifically on women as well. And so these sacrifice zones are really sacrificing of people's bodies as well, and not just territories and so on. And so we have to look at it very holistically, and how this brutal extractive industry actually functions. And so the climate justice movement, which I would consider in Africa to be somewhat weak but growing, is defined primarily at the moment in terms of the resistance, so the saying no against the destructive extractive projects, but is also about what I've been talking about, linking up and connecting of these issues, the realization at a very deep level that it's actually the system that is the root cause of the problems that we face right now, of the climate crisis, ecological crisis, social economic crisis. It is about actually tapping into that and revealing of that is the makings of a building of a strong movement against across the African region. So connecting up those issues, that it is the capitalist, patriarchal, just to really spell it out, racist system that is really the root cause of the crises that we have today. And unless we actually tap into that, we will never really be able to build a movement that gets us to sort of the future that we are all seeking, which is a completely different vision to one that we have now, that is based on this idea that some people can be sacrificed for the betterment and for the greed, in fact, of others, and so that others can live well. And so I think I'll probably leave it there for now, but I'm happy to dive into the conversation deeper as we go on.
Thank you so much, Trusha. And I see there's already questions coming in about the question of free, prior, and informed consent. So thank you for grounding us in the reality that this really violent stage of late capitalist extraction, which is essentially what we're living through now, it means violence against the earth, and it also means violence against women's bodies. And that's the real reality of this system. So we'll come back to some of these questions and themes further on. I'm going to turn to you now, Anjali, and it's my honor and privilege to welcome Anjali Appadurai, who's a climate justice campaigner with Sierra Club BC. Anjali works to connect climate issues to socioeconomic and political realities on the ground, and to center an equity framework in movement demands for climate justice, highlighting the realities of those who are on the front lines of the climate crisis. Before this work, Anjali cut her teeth in the global COP space through her work with the Third World Network and the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. And she spent 4 years working in the fossil fuel legal accountability area with the West Coast Environmental Law Association. So I know a fun fact about Anjali, which is that she's an extremely talented musician and singer, because she recorded the theme song for the Leap's podcast, Change Everything. So anytime you download and listen to that podcast, you get to hear Anjali's work. And so Anjali, I want to throw it to you, and I just want to set up the fact that you helped organize the youth contingent at the UN climate talks around the demand for equity and developing country solidarity. that was, starting so many years ago. Reflecting on this report now and hearing your colleagues speak today, what are your thoughts about how movements have reflected these demands and how they are now moving the needle in what's considered politically possible and how they're organizing both within and across borders?
Thanks so much, Katie, for such a great intro. It is a great little connection that we have that musical connection. It was so much fun recording that song for the LEAP podcast. And thanks so much, Jamie at MiningWatch, for having me today. As Katie mentioned, I'm a climate justice campaigner with Sierra Club BC, so I'm certainly not bringing that deep community organizing perspective that the other incredible speakers have brought, but I'm happy to bring the perspective of my work at an environmental nonprofit in Canada, so-called Canada in the global north, and what that, the imperative that gives to our work and the positionality that we hold. So in the past few years in the climate movements, especially in Canada where I work, there has been a growing sort of movement, a sort of push to connect questions of equity to the climate crisis. I think that was really accelerated this year when big questions around racism and by extension environmental racism were raised, and the US and by extension Canada sort of went through this massive reckoning around systemic racism in our institutions. And as Sierra Club BC, a very traditionally environmental organization, that was a great challenge for us to connect. How does systemic racism, how does environmental racism connect to our demands for climate solutions? And in my view, they absolutely connect, because to me, there's no real climate solution that isn't grounded in equity. So there's sort of two things that we're working towards at Sierra Club BC and working with our allied organizations towards, and that we have a long way to go on, but we actually absolutely must get to if we want to achieve climate justice. So as we're forming and working on our demands for climate justice, one thing that we really need to work on is recognizing that any climate solution that is not transformational is a false solution. And what I mean by that is, by transformational, I mean that it addresses equity on both a community and a global level, and it is born of a different logic than colonial extractivism and neoliberal capitalism. And we don't find this logic, the opposite logic to neoliberal extractivism, outside of Indigenous and traditional worldviews. And so therefore, transformational climate solutions are Indigenous-led and community-driven. So this has been a major line in the sand for us in our work of not advocating for climate solutions that don't pass that test, that don't actively advocate for equity and aren't grounded in Indigenous-led and community-driven demands. So the MiningWatch report, this excellent report, demonstrates exactly what happens when climate solutions don't address equity. So in a lot of our work in the past, we have echoed demands for rapid electrification, for example, and a lot of movements, especially in the global north, do echo that demand. But as the report demonstrates, as these amazing speakers have spoken to, that those demands often ignore the massive social, economic, and colonial impacts. So in our movements, we have to be so careful about which demands we advocate for, and to make sure that these demands are sourced from frontline climate impacted communities, because we have the potential to do more harm than good. And the second sort of big pillar that we're trying to model our climate campaign around is that we need to develop a new internationalism in our work, especially as movements in industrialized rich nations. And there's a fine balance that we have to strike with that. And there's a tendency in climate movements in the global north to stay rooted in national demands for climate action, which are powerful and necessary in their own right. And I know that where I come from is the province of BC, and I live on unceded Coast Salish territories. There are vibrant Indigenous-led movements against fossil fuel expansion and these disastrous fossil fuel infrastructure projects like pipelines, dams, and LNG terminals. And often these territories where I live are the heart and soul, or sort of like the final front line of big national battles against the future of extractivism in Canada. And simultaneous, so we need to place our support and allow those movements to lead us in our work. But simultaneously, we need to hold this other reality that Canada's positionality in the global community is something that we're also inextricably tied with. And that's our imperative working in the global north in so-called Canada. There is, for example, a silent, powerful framework of trade deals that are upholding and deepening colonial and imperial inequities all around the world. Katie brought up the example of the Canadian mining industry operating in Latin America. And that's something that I don't think is at the forefront of our movements and definitely needs to be incorporated into our movement demands. Canadian mining in Latin America is able to use trade deals to undermine Indigenous rights, undermine community health, and undermine environmental regulations, and essentially act as this arm of Western imperialism and neoliberal economic expansion. And so then there's global expansion of neoliberalism that is also directly at odds with true transformational climate solutions. And that's what creates the sacrifice zones that have been such a theme of this panel so far. And these sacrifice zones are necessary to uphold the industrial global north way of life. And so that's something we need to really hold alongside our imperative to support the local battles and to be deeply involved and deeply in solidarity with especially the Indigenous-led movements in our area here in the global north. But we also have to recognize that this is a huge imperative as participants in this industrialized economy. So we need a Green New Deal. That is definitely one of the broadest and most comprehensive transformational solutions put forward. But more importantly, we need a global Green New Deal. And so that's why I think, Katie, your work with the LEAP is so critical on this, because the last thing we need is a Green New Deal for, say, Canada, for example, that is incomplete in its connections and its solidarity with other parts of the world, other struggles of the world that we're inextricably tied with. So any climate solution that we call for has to have that international solidarity and that acknowledgement of how we're participating in an imperial economy. And we need nothing less than that. So those are the sort of two pillars: transformational solutions only and new internationalism being incorporated in our work. So keeping those two pillars in mind and establishing greater connection to movements, I think, is the only way that sort of like the nonprofit sector in the global north and so-called Canada, where I'm from, can actually stand for real climate solutions and not false climate solutions. So that's my work, to actively practice solidarity in our work. And in terms of changing what's politically possible, I think that the youth-based movements of the past few years have really dramatically altered that window of what's politically possible, because the youth-based movements are demonstrating that they won't settle for anything less than transformational systems change. So it's our work to incorporate international solidarity in that and incorporate this understanding and analysis of how sacrifice zones and neoliberal capital expansion is something to definitely avoid in our work. So I think I'm pretty much over time, so I'll pass it onwards.
Thank you, Anjali. Thank you for bringing the fire from Sierra Club. It's actually kind of amazing to see just how much the mainstream of the Green movement has been dragged along by these social movements. And it's absolutely incredible to see these demands being echoed from these groups. And your work long precedes you joining up in Sierra Club. So thank you for that. I really appreciated in your talk how you grounded and really defined what we're talking about when we talk about equitable transition, when we talk about transformational change. It's remarkable to me how quickly these words can get co-opted and just kind of used without having anything attached to them. So really, the way you said, this is what I mean by this, it had really stuck with me. So we're going to come back to that. This tension around, yes, we need a transition. No, we cannot do it with the same logic that got us into this problem, is going to be a subject of our open conversation. But I'm going to turn now to our last speaker, who is MiningWatch's Hugo Lapointe. He is the Canada Program Coordinator at MiningWatch. After training as a geological engineer, Hugo abandoned the industry 15 years ago to become a key leader in advocating for legal reforms to protect communities. Hugo, my apologies, hold on. To protect communities, Indigenous rights, and ecosystems from irresponsible mining practices in Canada. Hugo co-founded the Quebec Meilleure Mine Coalition and the BC Mining Law Reform Network, and is a member of Canada's National Orphaned and Abandoned Mines Initiative and Quebec's Mining Ministry Advisory Committee. So something you might not know about Hugo is that he had to abandon his dreams of becoming a farmer when he started his apprenticeship and realized he was allergic to hay, horses, cattle, and cats. He's also the chair of the board of his housing cooperative in Gatineau, Quebec, where he lives with his partner and 2 kids, and he is celebrating his 43rd birthday this week. So happy birthday, Hugo, and over to you for a report back. Hugo, you've been working with communities across Quebec and in BC who are suddenly finding themselves on the front lines of these new mining sacrifice zones, going right up to, you know, what settlers like to consider cottage country. Tell us a little bit about how, in this moment where our governments are suddenly seeing, the Canadian, Quebec, provincial governments are seeing dollar signs in their eyes around this idea of mineral extraction to feed the demand for electrification. How are communities resisting and fighting back, and how are they winning?
Thank you, Katie. Is the sound okay? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to this session to talk about the Canadian situation. I thought, you know, I have a lot of things to say, but I thought I could jump in with your question in highlighting a few concrete cases on the ground that we work on. So I'm going to start with Quebec and then do a quick overview of BC. So ever since we've seen an increase in demand for those minerals needed in the energy transition. So when we talk about batteries for electric vehicles in particular is a huge part of the demand, whether it's wind turbines, solar. We've seen an increase in mineral exploration for those specific minerals, including in Canada, of course, all across the planet, but also including in Canada, particularly in Quebec, lithium, graphite, and to some extent, nickel, rare earth, are sought minerals. And over the last few years, we've seen a boom in mineral exploration for those minerals in Quebec. For example, graphite and lithium more or less exploded by 10 up to 20, in some cases 700% in exploration in different regions in Quebec. So that translates concretely on the ground with an increased number of mining claims in different municipalities or Indigenous peoples' territories. It means exploration companies coming down on those lands. Often new areas, they're not necessarily traditional mining regions, they're new mining regions. And so we've seen reaction and increasing resistance to this extractivism that is coming down in different regions in Quebec. So one example that we've been working on over the last few years, I'm going to pull up this picture. Those are folks from the Saint-Michel-des-Saints community. It's about 2 hours north of Montreal, close to a very large lake, Lake Taureau. It's a known area for tourism, ecotourism. It's a cottaging country area just beside the National Park of Mont-Tremblant, for those who know a bit of geography here. And so this Nouveau Monde Graphite project has gone through an environmental impact assessment. They're proposing a very large open pit, about 2.5 kilometers long. It would produce approximately 100 million tons of mine waste, much of it toxic, with lots of acid rock drainage potential. And it's directly in the watershed of this Lac Toro. So this community of several hundred families mobilized over the last 2 years to try and stop this project in this particular area. What they're offering as an alternative, as you were talking about earlier, Katie, the importance of resistance and alternative, what they're saying is, listen, Quebec is very large. You know, it's like 2-3 times the size of France. It has lots of resources all across the province. There are 2 or 3 other graphite projects that are fairly advanced in the province, some of them with higher grades, which would produce less waste. Why not extracting those resources instead of sacrificing a specific zone? So that's one example. Another quick example I'm going to mention about is the Sayona mining example. So now that example, sorry, I'm just going to leave it a bit more. That example, it's a project that is being proposed very close to a highly valued source of natural spring water in the Abitibi region. That's about 8 hours north of Toronto, northwest of Montreal. It's the same spring water source esker that feeds the ESCA water that you see in the stores in those bottles. So that's where the ESCA water is coming from, in that same region. So we've seen an unprecedented resistant movement in this region, which is the traditional mining regions with dozens of mining projects. But the communities, the region, mobilized municipalities, thousands of people, hundreds of people went in the street many times to say, listen, we need a full environmental impact assessment before mining close to this spring water area, which is highly valued. Another quick case I'm going to mention about is the Grenville-sur-la-Rouge case. Grenville-sur-la-Rouge, again, this is a graphite project, fairly small, but in a very sensitive area, about an hour east of Ottawa, an hour and a half east of Ottawa. And basically, after the municipality said no to the project, they didn't want this particular type of economic development because they value the health of the land, the environment. Because they say no, the company sued the municipality for $96 million using the Quebec Mining Act as leverage, arguing that the Quebec Mining Act doesn't allow municipality to have a say, which actually they're right. But in the end, they managed to pull out an agreement with the company. The company abandoned the suit earlier this year, and the company agreed to subject the project to an environmental impact assessment. So the story will go on. In Quebec, First Nations rights are also, Indigenous rights are also not respected, particularly with regards to the Colonial Mining Act that is still in effect. So the free entry mining principle, which allows companies to acquire mining claims and allow companies to go on the land to explore, conduct some work without informing, without consulting, without obtaining the consent of communities is an ongoing issue. And the Barrier Lake Algonquin Nation is actually bringing the Quebec government to court to change this this colonial law to align with the constitutional and international rights of Indigenous peoples. Just very quickly, moving on to BC, British Columbia, where just about a year ago we launched a BC mining law reform network. The battle goes on, particularly on the FPIC front, so for the free, prior, and informed consent. 2 examples: the Tsikootan National Government have been fighting for over a decade against CICO, Prosperity, and a new Prosperity mine project, going to court. It's a long story that I don't have time to explain here, but the point is, here we go. You have a nation that is being upheld by this project for over a decade, still fighting it today. It's not resolved. They're trying to protect, again, a sacred land, which they value and want to protect for future generation. It's an ongoing struggle. Again, in BC, another example in recent years was the Stakamips Nation, who successfully so far fought the KGHM Ajax copper mine again in a sacred area, Pipsel area. But the problem that we're facing with the BC mining law, as much similar to Quebec, is it's still rooted in colonial gold rushes of the 19th century. It needs to be reformed to respect constitutional and international Indigenous rights today. And what happens often with these projects is they never die, and despite the wins, the short-term wins, it's in our experience, it's an ongoing battle. So the point is, Canada, yes, is an imperial power of mining across the planet, but it's also in Canada. It has a massive extractive industry. And there's a lot of work to do here, both on the community front, FPIC, in helping them to protect sacrifice zones, but also on the environmental protection for better practices around mine. So, that's that.
Fabulous, Ugo. Thank you so much. I see already there's a question about the Mount Poly mine disaster in the chat and whether enough has been done to reform things since then that I think will be a good fit for you. And I want to use that to pivot to a more open conversation among our panelists. And so folks can start to take questions from the audience. We've had some great questions coming in. So I want to say to our panelists, take a look at the Q&A section, because there's some questions that are specific to some of you. I see one for Ramon, for Trisha, for Whit, and a few others as well. So I guess, Jamie, you're not going to come back into this section, right? So hopefully the audience can see all of us now. Anjali will put her camera on and rejoin, and we're going to have a bit more of an open forum at this point. So what I wanted to get to, I'm going to throw out a few big sticky questions first, and then we'll get to some of the more specific questions that have come up in the chat. I have a naive question for each of you, which is about this question of consent. And, you know, on one side, we talk about this NIMBYism, not in my backyard. And a lot of communities are saying, yeah, not in my backyard. This is our water, our land. We don't want to ruin it. Is there actually a model where meaningful consent is possible here and that communities would willingly want to be part of this in a way that doesn't actually destroy these resources? Like, as someone who's a non-expert here, is this possible? Or is this industry just actually unable to operate on that level? So we have a specific question about free, prior, and informed consent, that framework and how it's put into place. And we've already seen in Canada how it's been used to say, oh no, when we say consent, we mean consultation. But if anyone can dig into a little bit of the difficulties of that, and just, is this even possible as a framework? And do you have examples where you've seen this actually work? Trisha, I want to put you on the spot. Can I?
Sure you can, but I don't feel like I have a comfortable answer for you on this. I mean, our experience is in exactly how you framed it, actually, that, you know, it's about consultation and not consent, because real meaningful consent would be in contradiction to what the extractive industry is trying to do, right? It is fundamentally destructive and would, if it is based on extractivism, right? So we know large-scale exploitation for profit. It is generally and is always extremely destructive and going to be harmful to people and the environment. And so it can't, there's a contradiction there where there can't really be a meaningful consultation, which would be against the logic of what the extractive industry is trying to do. So that would be my gut feeling about it. And I have never seen an instance where that comes into play. I think it is more about the community's real awareness about what the impacts of that particular project will be, and then being able to assert a right to be able to, or feel that they can assert a right to be able to say no to it. So I think it lies more on the other side than on the side of the industry, which is trying to extract a yes from the community. So that would be my sense of it. And really, the problem with the right to say no, I mean, even in Africa, which I think some folks were pointing to about the FPIC and so on, we don't have FPIC here because communities aren't recognized as indigenous. And I think the FPIC only falls under the sort of FPIC indigenous provision, so under an actual FPIC. And so we have a second hurdle there as well in Africa, where well, first, I mean, you get the state and transnational corporations who don't even want you to recognize that you have a right? That this is a right that you can assert. And so there's a fundamental deceit that happens anyway. But even if there is some level of democratic understandings about participation and so on, communities generally tend to have the tail end of that kind of understanding. They have the least amount of understanding because these kind of democratic norms, for example, translate the last to these communities. They never really go as far as that, unless you know your communication methods and the willingness of the state is also to be able to really get that. So I would just say that on the other side of the saying no, there also has to be a deep-rooted sense of the community's understanding of what this will mean, which is, as we know from colonialist times, is not something that you understand. You don't understand what you don't know and how that's going to be, you know, what's going to happen. And so it can come from a deep-rooted sense of we can see that this is going to be fundamentally destructive, but there are obviously bigger efforts to sort of conscientize communities as well about sort of what could happen in frontier sort of communities in Africa where coal is coming in for the first time. So coal plants, for example, are coming in for the first time. What we're seeing happening is that communities are reaching out to other communities to try and understand this, where there are coal projects. I mean, we have a situation and I was talking about Samkele before, but there's two communities that are just divided by a river. And on one side, the community had a coal mine, and there was massive impacts, obviously. But on the other side, where a new coal mine was coming up, they had absolutely no awareness, no understanding about what this was going to mean, and had to sort of rely on what the company was saying. But there was a bridging of the divide and a sort of the bringing together of the communities through many efforts. And now understanding from these communities of what could actually happen. And so there's a much better sort of articulation, clearer and more sort of strengthened articulation of saying no. So that's my very long, sort of, and complicated and nuanced sort of,
It's great. I mean, the informed piece of free, prior, and informed consent is a key piece, but it is fascinating just to see how quickly governments and corporations are able to wriggle out of these agreements and frameworks as well. Rahman, you were able to speak to this a little bit from your experience, then we'll throw to Whit.
Sure. I agree with Trusha about the impossibility of speaking of sustainable mining, not at this like large scale mining at all. An ecosystem cannot fulfill the world's mineral needs. It's impossible, just impossible, physically impossible, environmentally and socially impossible as well. So I think that for consent, like real consent, you will need equal conditions for dialogue or a sort of negotiation. And that cannot exist among a community and a large company or the state. I have the Mapuche, the Wenufoye flag behind. These peoples are resisting for centuries, and they're facing repression. There are Mapuche political prisoners because of their defending the rivers, the lakes, and the forests. So if the same situation is not happening here in Atacama, it's maybe because of that. People know what can happen when they resist until the end. And in the case of lithium, in the case of SQM and Albemarle, for example, like just to be very specific, these companies are before the indigenous peoples were recognized by the state. So these projects are there before that, and also before the ratification of ILO 169. So what they do now is just to actually, related to some question that I saw in the chat, is that what they do is like these good neighbor, agreements. So in order to continue operating, or in order to expand their operations, they choose one group or one kind of people in the territory, in this case, some communities, which have the freedom to negotiate and even the right to do that, because they cannot be told what to do or not by anyone, of course. But that doesn't mean that agreements equal sustainability or better practices whatsoever. So it's two completely different things. And what the companies do and what the state does is actually to say, since we have this agreement, now we are a responsible, sustainable company, while the practices are exactly the same. And while the environmental damage has already been done for decades. So that it's one thing. And also, like, what are the chances for the communities to say no, actually, to these projects? Another case, I don't want to be too long on this, but in the Atacama region, in Maricunga salt flat, the other salt flat that I told you about before, what the companies are doing is actually choosing the communities that they know that might be willing to negotiate, and ignoring the communities that oppose the projects. So they just go and they say, okay, we met these communities. They don't conduct any consultation. They just sign direct agreements, and that's what is useful enough for the environmental authorities in Chile. So the authorities and the governments are also avoiding the proper consultations at any cost. And according to ILO 169, actually, the peoples should be consulted without discrimination. And we never see that. We always see a group of communities or a part of the people, but not all of them, because they know if they consulted everyone, they will face rejection. So they choose a small group or a certain group of them and negotiate, and sometimes offer things that they actually need and genuinely need, because the state isn't there. But I think that we really need to see that it's not always like the way they say they do it. And it's also part of like a model. I was at PDAC actually this year, and I attended some of the talks, and how they teach the companies actually to approach indigenous communities. And they actually provide some manuals with step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 with the strategies actually to go in the territories, to approach the communities. And now the government of Chile, through the Ministry of Mining, actually the Ministry of Mining was at PDAC as well, and was saying that everything was perfect in the country, while the police was repressing people, while there were protests here in Atacama actually at the very same time. And they were so now the Ministry of Mining is actually looking for like social actors within the salt flats or next to the salt flats. So they want to identify the communities, NGOs, organizations, social environmental movements to cop them. So it's part of their strategy. They know very well what they're doing, They know what are the weak points, and they find them, and that's how they attack. That's what I want to say.
So I want to pivot to another big sticky question with your permission. This is the question, it's absolutely clear reading this report and through all of the comments that we've heard that there's no path to continuing on the same level of economic growth and consumption that we have been on, but just painting it green. This is a recipe for turning most of this planet into a complete sacrifice zone and going so far beyond even the what is even available in the earth. So there's just no path where this is going to happen. So my question to this panel is, why is the word degrowth? Why is the question of not continuing with the status quo such a dirty word? Whit, I'm going to throw it to you first, because I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about this and what the alternatives look like. But let's get real about what's possible here and what needs to be done, especially in the global north.
Sure, thanks very much. I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and I guess, although I hate to kind of to focus in on it, I think some of the problem, and I expand out from that, some of the problem is to do with the name degrowth. I mean, it's been quite a contested term, and I understand it's partly come up with this idea to challenge us. And we certainly, we don't need GDP growth as the basis of our economics. It's clear in a limited planet now that that's out of date. At the same time, you think, well, if you're going to come up with a name for something, what it's doing is it's effectively challenging that idea of growth, which is almost starting from a negative point of view. And actually, what we're talking about here is we're actually talking about a leveling up of humanity. We're talking about stopping the idea of absurd excess growth, which is unnecessary. And those are actually joyful things. I mean, those are things, these life we should be celebrating. We should be celebrating the idea of doing away with consumerism as something, buying a new electric vehicle as something that's going to make us happy, and going back to the idea of communities that's going to make us happy. I think one thing we need is we need a new term for it. I mean, you've got the indigenous idea of buen vivir, and in some ways, that good life idea is what we want to be aiming for. So I would like to see a rebranding of it in a way. I think that's where it comes back to that idea we mentioned at the start on that circular society I mentioned. So, and this also goes to answer one of the questions that was in the Q&A as well. Because the idea of circular economy is an excellent idea. I think we clearly, part of this idea of extractivism is the idea that we're mining, we're taking all of these resources, we're just using them, we're consuming them, we're dumping them. So it's a great idea if we have a circular economy where we're going from cradle to cradle, we're reusing those resources, etc. It's still possible to have that and have an increasing economy. You could still have that, and you could still be going for the idea of building more and more cars, still using more and more resources, but you're recycling them, etc. And that's not enough. Not enough in terms of the planetary boundary we've got. I came across, and I didn't invent this idea of a circular society. There's an academic called Friant who's written on it. And I just loved it. It clicked in my head when I saw it, because it seemed to me the expression of that idea that we're not basing it on the idea of economy. We're basing on the idea of society. We're basing on the idea of all of us around the world having an idea of where we want to go. I think to me, that also speaks to the idea of degrowth, but perhaps it turns it on its head, and it turns it on its head in a more positive way, I would say.
I love it. That's a great reframe of it. And I want to put Anjali on the spot. And Ugo, I just want to give you a heads up that there's a lot of Canada specific questions here that I would love to get you to do a rapid fire on a few of these ones that have come up in the chat. But Anjali, I want to ask you about this tension of why doesn't the mainstream green movement, why is it so hard to tell the truth about what is required here? How do we get mainstream environmental movements to start to get behind this message that actually business as usual is not going to work?
Yeah, this is a question of my life, and this is a big challenge for traditional environmental movements, especially in North America, and I can speak for, I guess, Canada, Canadian green organizations. I mean, if we want to go back to the root of it, I think that green movements and green groups in North America are deeply rooted in a very colonial conservation legacy and are still mired in that to a large extent. Like, we come from this legacy. I hesitate to say we, but these organizations come from a legacy that is rooted in stealing Indigenous land, putting fences around it, and saying, let's protect and conserve this. And it's rooted in notions of wilderness and pristine sort of nature. And so I think it's really difficult once the green sector has formed an identity around that and has a dedicated base of supporters based around that concept of legacy, conservation legacy. It's so hard to make the leap into incorporating deep economic analysis around inequity, colonialism, and capitalism, and how those questions are inextricably tied with questions of the so-called environment. I think there's a big leap, like a big jump to make between this like dichotomy of like environment versus the economy, or environment versus social justice, or the environment or nature somehow being separate from these socioeconomic issues in general. And I think for those of you speaking from different parts of the world, that's not a thing like in your movements, but definitely in North America, that's still a chasm that we have to bridge. And I really love how you said, with like leveling up of humanity. I think what we fail to do is present an actual vision for something better. And that's why I'm attracted to this idea of the Green New Deal, because it's the first actual tangible thing that paints a picture of a better society where better values are at play. I think right now we're so caught up in like stopping harm to the environment and stopping, like keeping things as they are, that we're not developing an economic analysis. And that's something that I'm pushing us to do. But I love that, bringing in the values, bringing in a better vision, and leveling up values of humanity. It's a challenge.
I love that. And that's how we're going to close. So again, I know for progressives, it's so hard for us to think about the world when we win, but I am going to put each of you on the spot briefly to give us a little postcard from your work when we are on the other side. Now, Ugo, I hope you don't mind. There's been quite a few interesting, sticky questions that have come up about the Canadian context in the chat here. Were you able to see some of them?
No, I'm sorry, I can't.
Okay, so I'm going to give you my rapid fire summary, which is, what's your understanding of the strength of mining law reform in Canada since the Mount Poly disaster, from somebody who is in that community? Has enough changed so that this wouldn't happen again, is the simple question. There's a question about the power of the mining lobby in Canada and the weak powers of the ombudsman and oversight provisions, and ways that we can resist that. And then there's a question about the British Columbia government's new greenhouse gas targets, and whether that's an opportunity to push for mining reform. And Anjali, I don't know if that's one you'd want to speak to or not. But I'll probably get Ugo to touch on as much of this as possible, and then we're going to start to move to our wrap up. So the last thing I want to say to our participants who are by their laptops is, if you see a question here that you can answer, then please do your best to type a few answers in there. And so there's so many great questions coming in from the audience. Thank you so much. So Ugo, I know those are big, meaty questions, but jump in and give us your best take on mining reform and the power of the lobby here.
Yeah, I know we don't have much time, so I'm just going to rapid fire a few answers here. And to come back to the FPIC question, is it possible in the Canadian context? I think the short answer is yes. Some communities have succeeded at implementing FPIC towards mining project, but as Ramon said very eloquently, it's a question of power relations. And studies show, for example, Karen Ofahale, Ginger Gibson's work on impact and benefit agreements are pretty clear. The more political power clout you have, the better the agreement and the deal you've got. The issue is really, from our perspective with the work we do, is when it's the right to say no. When it's time to say no, this is where a barrier, a roadblock happens, and that's very complicated. On the Mount Poly question, that was the largest mine waste spill in Canadian history in 2014. Over 24 billion liters of mine waste went into Queneau Lake. The waste is still sitting there. The company was never charged by any level of government, not BC, not federal. Worse, they walked away with a $100 million check from an engineering company that they sued over this spill. The communities that are affected, the Xatul Nation, the Williams Lake Indian Band, the community residents in Lightly still have to deal with the liability and legacy of that mine waste. There are 2 pipelines currently into the lake spewing the untreated mine waste water. It's an ongoing issue. On the mining lobby, the power of the mining lobby, it's true. Sometimes I explain to people, it's probably one, or if not the sort of imperial lobby that we've got in Canada is mining. Toronto, as you mentioned, Katie, earlier on, is home to over 50, some say 60% of global mining companies. Most of the capital that is raised for supporting exploration, extraction here and internationally is out of Toronto and Vancouver. So this is a power clout, right? It's the mining companies, but it's the law firms, it's the engineering firms. We're talking strong lobby. So it's hard for any government, whether provincial, federal, to resist and to implement change that are needed. A brief way to explain it is, as soon as there's a minister or that sticks his or her neck out, it's pretty quickly there'll be a backlash in our experience. So it takes a lot of courage. And on that note, the BC Auditor General report in 2016 rightly pointed to regulatory capture that is often happening in the ministries, the mining ministries department. And we see this in Ontario, we see this in Quebec. It's not that necessarily those people in the departments mean bad, they mean well, but the pressure from the industry is very strong indeed. On the climate targets and on the question of degrowth, the way the Quebec Coalition have handled this particular question is they're trying to push the message that we need policies that address low carbon, low material solutions. Public discourses, policies are too narrowly focused on low carbon and not inclusive of everything we've talked in this call today, including equity. But on the low material solutions, it's in the Quebec context, they're really targeting the need to reduce the number of cars on the roads. And that may seem simple, but it's not. And the way they're framing their proposals, the different climate groups and extractive groups in Quebec, is they're saying, not only we need to rethink how we build our cities, reduce the transportation needs, public transit, active transit, of course, but also fiscal incentives to get rid of polluting cars and so on and so on. So a lot of those solutions, which translate into low carbon solutions, are also low material solutions. And in some respect, if done right, can also address a lot of the equity questions, because frankly, an electric car is pretty expensive and not affordable to most people, even today. And it's definitely not a solution for addressing the climate crisis and different social crises that we're facing. Yeah, that was just an attempt to try to answer some of these questions.
You did great. You did great. And it's a formidable lobby and powerhouse of this mining industry in Canada. So thank you for speaking to that point and to this larger point about consumption and degrowth. So I want to close. We're just going to do a last go round and hear from each of the panelists. And then I believe we're lucky to have Monique coming back to close us out at 5 minutes to the hour. But I want to invite each of you to join me in a little exploration, a little experiment in utopian futurism. You know, I'm really lucky that at the organization that I work at, the LEAP, we've made this part of our work. The project that launched our organization, the LEAP Manifesto, came out of a gathering of 60 movement leaders from across this land who came together, and we forced ourselves for 2 or 3 days to actually think and talk about what a better life on the other side of energy transition could look like, one where we're not at each other's throats, you know, split amongst ourselves, amongst our different social movements, and throwing one community under the bus for the other one's economic benefit. So we've gotten to advance that practice a bit more in the past few years through a project we've worked on called A Message from the Future. And this is a video series where we've gotten to work with incredible artist, Molly Crabapple, who's used hand paintings to bring to life. The first film looked at what life could look like on the other side of a Green New Deal in the US. And more recently, we did one that was about life, what life could be if we took this moment in the pandemic and used it to start to chart a different future forward that is really about more global solidarity, looking out for each other. And the last line of that film is a world where no one is sacrificed and everyone is essential. And so I'll put myself on the spot, but I want to ask each of you, you know, when you think about what you are fighting for and what could be possible on the other side of that struggle, to just close by giving us a little glimpse of it. For me, I feel like, especially in the past few months of this pandemic, I've been struck by how time has changed, you know, and for people who live in the richest part of the world, like I do, who live in the highest consumption, highest waste areas, there is this question of like, well, what are we going to do to consume less and waste less, right? And it's like, this is the very bare minimum. But what I've been struck by is just this feeling, what we've seen over and over, is that people, in some ways, companies are talking about this. There's a COVID bump where suddenly everyone is just tied to their computers and working all the time, like people who are lucky enough to still have a white collar job like mine. And you haven't never necessarily had, you know, or people on the other side don't have the money or the time to actually take in a bit more of that rest or take stock to some degree. What I find myself wishing for is like less of the frozen pizza life, more of the cooking life. I want more time. When I think about what, for me as a 41-year-old, what feels most valuable to me, it really is time with the people that I love. And that is a low carbon activity. You know, the act of being in nature, the act of spending time with people that I care about that I haven't been able to see. I feel like all of these feel like the most precious commodity to me now. And so in some ways, when I think about that transition, what I think about is like, yeah, less travel, less consumption of material goods or just wasteful food, and just like more time with people that are important to me, doing things that we love, that are important. And that's what I try and hold in my heart, and that I really want to push for me and others who really need that feeling of getting off the treadmill. So a world where each of us is considered essential and no one is sacrificed, and where we actually really are able to look out for each other across borders. So Ramon, let me put you on the spot to talk a little bit about what things could look like in your situation if you were to win your struggles.
Well, I like to link our struggles with social movement in Chile, and the fact that we are now getting closer to a process where we will be able, for the first time, to have a democratic constitution. It's gonna be the first gender equal constitution of the world. So I think that many of our demands are within this movement, a post-extractivist economy, a post-patriarchal society. We cannot address growth as you can, because we are not there. But of course, we need to understand that we cannot go that way. So the growth is very important for us as well. In the most specific demands, like related to lithium extraction or the transition mineral extraction, I think that it would be much better if we addressed the crisis from climate justice, making very clear who's responsible for this crisis, who's paid the price for the industrial growth, who's also supposed to pay the price for the solutions, for the false solutions, basically the same people, who are the most vulnerable, indigenous rural communities, people living in places like Atacama Desert, in the mountains, near the rivers, in the deserts. These are the most vulnerable people, and they shouldn't be paying the price for the transition. So maybe starting from that point, it would be much easier to imagine the solutions, because we cannot have solutions actually. Even experts have very limited knowledge. We all have limited knowledge. We can all contribute just with some perspectives, points of view, but we need to build the transition like all together. And nobody knows better than the people in the territories, you know? So maybe it's more about the perspective with which we approach the crisis, hence the solutions, than a recipe, you know? So maybe being more democratic also on addressing the crisis and and the transitions, or maybe more than a transition, a transformation. That's what we need. That's it.
Beautiful. Thank you, Ramon. Thank you for joining us today. Trisha, I know it's almost 11 o'clock for you. Thank you so much for sticking with us and for your beautiful interventions. Can I ask you for one last one tonight?
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, just to echo, I think, what you both have said now. So very quickly and hopefully simply, the first one, I think, a world where human beings don't see themselves as apart from nature, as dominating nature, and as using nature as something to extract worth out of, that we are part of nature, we're part of this bigger ecosystem, and so that we live in harmony with the rest of the natural world. The second one, that obviously profit doesn't define our society, that the economy is not at the center of society, but that people and planet really is at the center of what we care about and what is our priority. And then lastly, just that we stop living to work and work to live, and forget and go beyond what capitalism has taught us, which is that we are slaves and cogs in this big machine, and that is our only value in life, but we are part of a bigger community, a bigger society, that we whole human beings with many other needs and wants. And yeah, that's it.
Beautiful. Thank you. Whit, over to you.
Thanks, Katie. I kind of wish I'd said yours now, which sounded more personally powerful than mine, but I think because I've been writing the report, briefly, three things come to mind. The first is that communities are empowered, particularly mine-infected communities are empowered to live the lives they want. And that means ideally rejecting that idea of extractivism. I think if I talk to the FPIC thing, I would just say it's very important that a lot of communities are using the space to create their own protocols, their own rules, etc. I think that's part of it. It's about grabbing back the power, really. That's important. Second is, I think essential is ensuring that mining companies are broken up or restricted in their power. So, we would ensure that those multinationals, there is binding legislation on them with regard to human rights environments. They're not externalizing their costs. And then the third is that, is that circular society I talked about, which, as I mentioned, I'm sure is going to give us, and particularly me, a great deal more satisfaction sitting with my chilies in that wonderful future. And thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak.
Beautiful. Thank you, Whit. Anjali.
In a future in which this beautiful vision that we're all holding has come to life, I think there will be in my life a lot more art, like space for whatever wants to express itself within each of us to be expressed without the confines of the profit-driven framework surrounding us. So just art to capture the beauty of what we see around us. There will be sort of life will be centered around the sacred, and the sacred will be a much larger thread through our lives, because we will see everything around us and everyone as sacred. Our society will not be organized around the need for domination or the need for accumulation. So yeah, art and sacredness and deep relationships. What more could we want?
Beautiful. Spoken like a true artist as well. Thank you, Anjali, and thank you so much for your interventions today. Ugo, I'm going to give you the last word from our panel, and then we're going to turn back and welcome back Monique for a short closing of the event today. So thank you, all of you, and over to you, Ugo.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, so I'd say three things on my side. I really wish that from a global north perspective, coming from an affluent countries, that we really took more of a responsibility, both as individuals, but also state and societal wise, to really work at reducing our consumption of material. We have a huge responsibility, and maybe a concrete dream, maybe a pipe dream, would be to develop policies to really cut down on some of the minerals that we don't need at all. Coal mining, for example, it's still the main source of mine waste on the planet. And gold mining, 1 out of 4 mines in Canada are gold mines, and on the planet, 1 out of 4 mines as well. We don't need gold, we don't need coal, uranium, asbestos. There are things we know we don't need, we keep in the ground. So bringing the conversation to a level high enough so we can keep those minerals we don't need in the ground could be helpful. And then the last thing is, I think for everybody to be mindful of, if you're a politician or a department person listening to this, or industry person, because there are some of you online probably, but anyone, in fact, so it's reminding ourselves that a low material life is very much a rich life as well. So thank you.
Beautiful. Great last thought. Thank you all so much. And I'm so honored to welcome back Monique Manach to close out our event. Monique, welcome back and thank you.
Thank you. I was so taken by what I heard today. And Ugo, I'm so happy you mentioned Barrier Lake. That's my community. And I know that the people spent over a year in land defender camps. They wanted to do a 5-kilometer or 7-kilometer open pit mine in the heart of our territory, in the heart of our hunting and trapping and fishing grounds. And again, the story isn't over, but it's quiet for now. But I'm sure they'll be back. Once they clear cut, then they came back and they want to mine. And they didn't need to ask permission. And they were all over the land. And it was MiningWatch who let us know. And see, that to me speaks so highly of the efforts of MiningWatch and of the partners and collaborators and organizations and people who, it gives me such hope of the, that there are people out there who understand that we are the stewards. It is our responsibility. And for us, and I loved what I didn't catch her, the young lady was saying about arts and sacredness. It is our sacred responsibility to steward the land and to take care of the land and to nourish that connection that we have with the land. And to hear that there are people the world over who are taking up those ideals and those causes and really working towards a better earth. It's very hopeful. And I encourage everyone to continue to talk to each other and to continue to build momentum. And you're right, there's so many minerals we don't need. There's no reason, there's absolutely no reason for the activities to go on except for profit. And there's a lot of sayings about eventually people will realize you can't eat money. So I just want to close this space. Kachimigwich Jemnido, thank you for all the words and all the actions and all the caring and compassion that was shown here today. Help people to bring that spirit into their lives and take it with them and remember it and use it to be stronger and to work together to protect Mother Earth and to build relationships for a better future for all of us. Kachimigwich, 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 Kachimigwich. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Monique. Thank you for taking us out in a good way. I want to thank all of the participants. Thank you for your work on the ground. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience here today. I want to thank all the participants, the audience members who took time out of their day and evening to come and be part of this conversation as well, for each of you who are engaged in struggle in your own communities. And finally, I want to thank our colleagues at MiningWatch and at The Leap for hosting this event today. Please do download the report. Well done, Jamie. Well done to the MiningWatch team. It's a fantastic report that you can find on their website. And I want to thank Kirsten for all the support in the back end while we were doing this work, to our wonderful simultaneous interpreters, Juliet and Michael. We appreciate you. And have a wonderful day. Keep up your struggles. We appreciate you. Until next time.